Morning, everyone. My name is Simon Hawthorne, and I'm the Chief Legal Officer for UnitedHealthcare's Global Solutions business. I've been working as a lawyer in international healthcare and health insurance for just over 20 years, and it's an extremely interesting time to be a lawyer in this space, as there are plenty of things to think about. Coming to you from my home in the UK under strict lockdown conditions and wearing a tie for the first time in a long time. I'm very pleased to be here today and really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. We lawyers don't often get allowed out like this, so thank you. I'm joined by my colleague, Sarah Dubinsky. Sarah will take you through some of the legal implications and trends impacting on the employer's duty of care toward employees in the wake of the pandemic. Following that, I'll discuss three specific areas of interest from an international legal perspective. The first being the question, can employers require employees to get a COVID vaccine? The second being employee requests to work overseas during the pandemic. And the third, taking a look at some of the legal implications around international telemedicine. With that, I'll hand it over to Sarah to get started. Sarah? You're on mute, Sarah, I think.
My apologies, sorry about that. Hi everyone, I am Sarah Dubinsky and am a Senior Associate General Counsel to our UnitedHealthcare Global Solutions business. And as Simon mentioned, I'm going to talk about an employer's duty of care, particularly in light of the pandemic. It's generally well settled that employers have a legal duty of care to protect the health and safety of their employees. And the pandemic has really increased the focus on an employer's duty of care to its employees, both domestically and abroad, including the employer's duty to understand the threats its employees may face in light of COVID and how to respond to these threats from a preventative standpoint. As Dr. Amit mentioned, as a result, employers are considering how they can better support employee health and well-being. They are increasingly offering employee assistance programs and other counseling resources. Some are even offering additional employee benefits as a result of the pandemic, including childcare options, expanded leave options, even financial wellness programs. And these benefits are really designed to help employees meet both the personal and work challenges imposed by the pandemic. Also, I think we're seeing that some larger employers for the first time, even outside of the healthcare sector, are appointing chief medical officers to direct their organization's overall wellness strategy. And in some jurisdictions, there are specific mental health duties on employers. And elsewhere, laws which have applied for other purposes are kind of being expanded to encompass mental health. And one legislative theme which is becoming increasingly common is an employee's right to disconnect from their work computer, emails, and phone calls after working hours. And this right was actually introduced in France in 2017. But since then, other countries have adopted similar measures, including Spain and Italy. And now Canada is working on a similar right to disconnect as part of its overall governmental response to the mental health aspects of COVID. Also, in the European Union, they're now considering an EU-wide right to disconnect. So it's going to be interesting to see how this sort of plays out and if more countries ultimately decide to adopt a similar approach. And of course, as Scott sort of touched upon, a big issue for employers right now is whether they can or should require employees to be vaccinated. And I'm going to talk about what's going on in the US in this regard. Simon's going to sort of touch upon what's happening outside of the US. But in addition to the return to work issues and employers have been dealing with, obviously the vaccine is now kind of presenting issues as well. And in December, the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission, or EEOC, did release guidance on this issue. And they essentially stated that under the Americans with Disabilities Act, employers can enforce safety-based qualification standards for workers, including those aimed at ensuring people do not pose a direct threat to the health and safety of others in the workplace. And such standards can include a vaccination requirement. Also, under the rules of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA, which is part of the US Department of Labor, there is a general requirement for employers to maintain a workplace free from serious and recognized hazards. And interestingly, if an employer doesn't sort of mandate vaccines and people don't receive them, other employees could allege that the employer has failed to provide a safe and healthy work environment in accordance with OSHA rules. Also, when deciding to sort of implement a vaccination policy, employers need to be aware that under the ADA, the vaccination policy really should include a careful process for addressing workers whose medical conditions prevent them from safely taking the vaccine. These workers need to be provided with reasonable job accommodations, which could include working remotely, masks, social distancing, and in some cases, another position. And given the newness of the vaccines, there's not complete clarity on which medical conditions would pose a risk and therefore constitute a legitimate reason for being exempted from an employer vaccination program. So this means that there really is, these are gray areas for both employees and employers. Also, under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, employer vaccination policies need a process for exempting and accommodating workers with sincerely held religious objections to vaccinations. And there's really a lot of uncertainty around what constitutes a legitimate and applicable religious belief for this purpose. The definition of religion is very broad. However, it does appear based on the EEOC guidance that legal protections likely wouldn't extend to an anti-vaxxer whose opposition is rooted in something other than faith. Also, the EEOC did clarify that employers can request supporting information from the employee if they are skeptical about the religious accommodation request. And as Scott mentioned earlier, employees would, other than these legally protected reasons, employees could just object to the vaccination for other purposes, and this needs to be very seriously considered by employers, as if a significant portion of the workforce refuses to comply with a mandated vaccination requirement, the employer will be put in a very difficult position of either adhering to the mandate and terminating all of the employees who didn't comply, or deviating from the mandate for certain employees. And if they do that, that can obviously increase the risk of discrimination claims. There is some precedent in the United States in terms of requiring vaccines for employees. For example, nursing homes, many hospitals, as well as the US military have been requiring vaccinations for years. Also, as many of us know, states require vaccinations in order for children to attend schools. And interestingly, at least one school district has already come out and announced that they will require vaccinations in their schools. So far, it doesn't appear that many US employers have announced firm plans for a COVID-19 vaccination mandate, but it does appear that some are considering it. Employers also have an incentive to maintain their employees' health through vaccinations, as health obviously promotes employee retention, morale, and workplace productivity in general. Employers in the US also arguably have a financial incentive, as they pay for most of the costs associated with their employees' health care. And while they're not obliged to pay for the vaccinations, even if they do mandate them, some employers have felt that this is a good idea and have already come out and announced that they will do this. And we see that employers are already taking sort of different approaches. Some are offering financial incentives for their employees to take the vaccine. Some examples that come to mind are Aldi, the grocery store chain, and the Dollar General stores. Privacy is also a legal issue to be aware of in relation to any employer vaccination policy. In the US, employee health data, which includes information about an employee's medical condition or prescription information, is protected under the law. And it generally needs to be kept separate from employment records and not be used to make an employment related decision. And this is interesting because these privacy protections can also sometimes conflict with employer safety goals. So for example, in order to achieve a safer workplace, vaccination status could be used to determine who can work in jobs with more virus spreading risks, like those with more coworker or customer contact. And if a significant number of people in a workplace seek exemption, reassigning large numbers of employees away from their original jobs effectively means health data is being used to make employment decisions. So employers really should be cognizant of that point. And considering all of these issues, employers are already applying marketing principles in order to promote voluntary vaccination and minimize the likelihood of large numbers of employees seeking an exemption from the vaccine. So for example, they are disseminating targeted, tailored education materials. They're highlighting their senior executives' enthusiasm about receiving the vaccination themselves. And ensuring the messaging that goes to employees is both scientifically accurate and effective for the diverse populations within a workforce. So in general, I think it's going to be really interesting to see what approaches employers take in relation to this issue over time. With that, I will turn it back over to you, Simon. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Could you go to the next slide, please? And then the one after that. So I'm going to dive in with some thoughts from a German legal perspective to the question, can employers require an employee to get a COVID vaccine? And I've chosen Germany because it's well known for having very strong labour laws and protecting workers in particular. Very famously in the 1990s, someone who'd been convicted of murder won a claim for unfair dismissal against their employer. So that's kind of what you're up against there, though that case was nuanced and his murder conviction was overturned on appeal. But anyway, the notion of compelling employees to get a vaccine is controversial. In the UK, we had a famous businessman grab the headlines just a couple of weeks ago with his no jab, no job policy for London's largest plumbing business with over 1,000 workers. It created a lot of noise and headlines. In October 2020, a Berlin court passed a judgment in favour of an airport security company that required all employees to wear masks for the protection of co-workers. The employee who took the case to court wanted to work behind a screen instead of wearing a mask. As a matter of law, it was agreed that the employer can't demand that the employee look after his or her own health. That's up to them. The question for the court was whether the employer had given a reasonable instruction to the employee based on the need to protect co-workers. The answer, based on expert evidence which was given in the Berlin court, was yes, wearing a mask was a reasonable instruction to that employee to protect co-workers. So thinking on about that, the question as to what constitutes a reasonable instruction in order to protect co-workers and potentially members of the public or clients or customers will really assist in relation to a vaccine. So is the vaccine required in order to perform the role, like a driver having a driving license? I think this test sets the bar pretty high. Possibly I was thinking the pilot of a plane who might require he or she has been vaccinated before being allowed to travel. That may be required for the job in that case. Question also arises whether duties to someone who's not taken the vaccine, such as allowing someone to work from home or away from customers. If someone who doesn't get the vaccine becomes ill with COVID, would they be entitled to the same sick pay and contractual someone who has had the vaccine? Most analysts are thinking that the answer to that would be yes, such an employee would be entitled to the same benefits as someone who's had it. There are some practical considerations around all of this to think about rather than just in a legal vacuum. So the employees might well ask, well, when will the vaccine become available to me? You know, maybe it's going to be based on age or risk and so on in different countries. And how does an employer deal with an employee who says, well, I've been able to do my job perfectly well without a vaccine for the last 12 or 18 months before the vaccine becomes available. Why is it all of a sudden now you're telling me I can't do my job unless I have the vaccine? Maybe it's going to be tricky, I think, to argue that case. And another consideration is the worker says, well, if all my co-workers have had the vaccine, what difference does it make to their protection if I've had it or not? You know, if they're protected, then what's the risk? So in Germany and most other jurisdictions, it's generally speaking not going to be possible to dismiss an employee who refuses to have the vaccine, and the employer must take reasonable measures to prevent and reduce the risk of the spread of the virus. Next slide, please. I'm going to talk about considering employee requests to work overseas during the pandemic. I think this is a really interesting question. I'm looking at this from the perspective of an employer based in Hong Kong and the laws of that jurisdiction, but there's really going to be similar considerations in other territories. Hong Kong is an interesting case because I know of a few requests that have been made to companies based in Hong Kong. There are so many expatriates living there, and it's also one of the most expensive places in the world to live. So let's imagine, okay, let's go back, if you can cast your mind that far back to March 2020, and there's a French national living in Hong Kong who asks his Hong Kong employer, can I go home to France to see out the pandemic from there? I won't be in the office anyway, as everybody's working from home, and this should all blow over in a couple of weeks and I'll be back to normal. So I'll talk through a list of some key considerations. This isn't an exhaustive list of considerations, but I think you can safely consider it kind of the greatest hits here. So the first thing is dual employment rights. The question here arises, could the employee in France claim protections under French employment law, such as the right against unfair dismissal, the application of the Working Time Directive, requirements on the employer to pay overtime and so on? This is something that has to be looked at and considered. The second one is kind of near and dear to my heart, looking at benefits and allowances, but what about the employee's health insurance plan? Would that pay for claims in France if it's a domestic Hong Kong health plan? Most domestic plans only cover emergency overseas treatment. Could there be an obligation on the employer to enroll the employee in a French health plan, or even enroll the employee on a French pension plan? There are all sorts of different rights in different countries that require to be thought about. Immigration is obviously one of the top agenda items for globally mobile populations, and the question arises, is the employee able to live and work in France? In my example, obviously a French national would be, but let's just change the fact pattern a little bit and imagine it's an Australian normally living and working in Hong Kong who's got a holiday home in Provence, lucky guy, gal, and he wants to go there and work from home during the pandemic. Could the temporary departure affect his rights to return and live in Hong Kong as well? So you have to consider these immigration things before you allow an employee to move. There are some regulated roles, such as the chief financial officer in an insurance company or medical director of a medical clinic, where it may be a prerequisite that the position is held from someone in country, and it could be prohibited for these roles to be carried out remotely. So if someone moves overseas, then the company may be warned and could ultimately lose a license to conduct business in those jurisdictions. So that also needs to be considered. It very much depends on the type of role that the person holds. Income tax and social security, again, another key consideration for globally mobile populations that our clients come up against time and time again. But where and how will the employee be taxed while abroad? And there can be penalties for the employer for failure to pay social security contributions and so on. So if you're French person working at home from France, goes back to France and is working there for a year, the chances are French taxes have to be paid, and who's responsible for that? Data protection is something that I think everyone's heard an awful lot about. So in some ways, as a lawyer, it's nice to have COVID to talk about instead. But Does French privacy law and GDPR apply to the employee who's working from home in France? The answer is probably yes. So you need to think about that and give some consideration to it. When I talk about return to home country, I think this is quite interesting because one of my colleagues in Hong Kong was telling me that this situation actually arose for their company. They've had someone who's been working from France, who is an Australian as it happens, and they've said, okay, it's safe to come back to Hong Kong now. And he said, I don't want to come back. I like Provence better. It's nicer. I've got a big house in the country. I'm not living in a tiny flat. I'm enjoying life. I want to stay here. I've been able to do my job fine from here. The employer really doesn't know what to do. It's very difficult to argue that the person's not able to do the job because the person has been doing the job. So these are some of the considerations and things you need to think about whenever you get a request from an employee asking to work overseas. Often it's practical implications which are just difficult to implement. Could you set up a local payroll? Could you put in place local insurance plans? Could you develop local policies from a French compliant maternity rights plan to grievance procedure? Many of these questions all depend on the length of time an individual will spend overseas, as well as the seniority and nature of the role in question. And it can all become quite complicated quite quickly. Hopefully, Sarah and I have given you some things to think about from a legal perspective. So, you know, we appreciate your time here. And, oh, I wanted to mention international telemedicine. Sorry, I almost forgot. With international telemedicine, you know, there's been a huge uptake in telemedicine generally since the pandemic. And as is often the case, the law is catching up and lagging behind patient demand. So what's telemedicine anyway? I carried out quite extensive and painstaking research on this very question for you today. So with that in mind, here is the Wikipedia definition of telemedicine. It's health-related services and information via electronic information and information and telecommunication technologies. So I'm making a little bit of a joke about using Wikipedia to get a definition, but frankly, there are so many different definitions and ideas about what this means that Wiki's really as good as any. So the question arises as to whether an email or a telephone call could be telemedicine. Normal definitions in a vast array of countries can cover even audio-only communications, such as telephone calls. We've seen a lot of regulation and a lot of new law in allowing telemedicine at a national level in response to the unique demands placed on the healthcare system as a result of the pandemic. But most countries still don't have any regulation about telemedicine, so those services are governed usually inadequately under existing laws, governing the traditional kind of face-to-face doctor-patient consultations. I'd like to talk to you just quickly about international telemedicine. And what I mean by international telemedicine is where the medical professional is not living in the same country as the patient. So let's imagine we have a US citizen from Chicago living and working in China. Can his US cardiologist consult with this patient in China via video call, maybe even sharing live ECG results? The first question that arises is, what do we mean by practicing medicine? This isn't well defined, although there is quite an Chinese law in relation to this, just about. So how about we change the back path, have a Chinese sitting in the consultation, US cardiologist, and then how about we take the patient out of the picture and have the Chinese doctor deal direct with the US doctor and discuss the treatment plan? I think the risk diminishes as we go down through these scenarios. What about a second medical opinion, like a referral of medical notes from the Chinese to a US medical facility? Many Chinese hospitals are actively seeking joint ventures with US medical facilities for this type of service, extending into more fully participating in direct-to-patient consultations. The question also arises is whether the US doctor would require to be licensed with the Chinese authorities. So around the world, it's a patient's location is typically determinative of the licensing and registration regime for direct physician-patient encounters. Similar to the US, where physicians should generally be licensed in the state where the patient is receiving the services. Most non-US jurisdictions would require a physician to be locally licensed if providing consultations with patients in that territory. So it's a tricky area. Would Chinese data privacy laws apply? Probably. Some countries don't allow medical data to leave the country, so that's another issue for consideration. Would the US doctor's medical malpractice insurance cover them? Probably not. Something to think about, and may encourage doctors to be reluctant to provide extraterritorial advice and consultations. Another issue that's really live for expatriates is who will write the prescription for drugs when they can't be bought over the counter. You know, Chinese pharmacy is not going to accept a script from a doctor in Chicago, no matter how good he is. So there are many open questions which are more difficult to answer, and just some things to think about whenever we are considering the application of international telemedicine. Just like to finish up on that point. Thank you for your time, and leave it open to questions.